She ran from vows and veils straight into a stranger's barn. He offered her hay, not questions. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The rain had been falling for hours, a steady, rhythmic drumming on the old tin roof that usually lulled Thomas into sleep. But tonight, something felt off. Restless, he sat by the stove in his dimly lit kitchen, the wood crackling inside as he sipped lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug. Outside, the wind howled through the trees lining the edge of his field, bending branches like they were whispering secrets to the earth. It was just past midnight when he heard it. A knock, not at his front door, but faint and hesitant, coming from the direction of the barn. He stood slowly, setting the mug down with a quiet clink. The barn was a few dozen yards away, barely visible through the sheets of rain. Grabbing his jacket and flashlight, Thomas stepped out into the storm. The air slapped him with cold, the mud clinging to his boots with every step as he made his way across the gravel path. The barn loomed ahead, its doors slightly ajar, and the light inside flickered. He'd left it on earlier while checking on a calf. Another knock, softer this time. He pushed the door open wider. Standing just inside was a woman. Her coat was soaked through, hair plastered to her cheeks, her arms wrapped tightly around herself like she was holding her body together. Mud splattered her jeans and the edge of a duffel bag at her feet. She looked up as he entered, eyes wide and unsure, lips trembling more from uncertainty than cold. "I'm sorry," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where else to go." Thomas didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, really looked. The kind of look that wasn't searching for answers, just trying to understand. He could see she was scared, not of him, but of something bigger, something behind her, something she wasn't ready to talk about. "You can stay," he said simply. "There's hay in the back, it's dry. Not much, but it's warm." She blinked, surprised by the lack of questions. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas nodded once, then turned to leave. Just before he stepped back out into the rain, he paused. "If you need anything," he said without turning around, "I'll be in the house." Second light down the path. Then he disappeared into the storm, leaving her with the steady breath of horses and the soft hum of shelter. The smell of hay clung thick in the barn, sweet and earthy, mixing with the distant scent of horses and rain. The woman stood for a moment in the doorway, her bag still at her feet, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She didn't ask any more questions, and Thomas didn't offer any explanations. He just walked over to a wooden shelf tucked between two stalls, grabbed an old wool blanket folded neatly beside a few tools, and held it out to her. "It's clean," he said, nodding toward a stack of straw bales near the far wall. "You can bed down over there. It stays dry even in storms like this." She reached for the blanket slowly, as if unsure whether to trust the gesture. Her fingers brushed his, cold and trembling, and then she pulled it close to her chest like armor. "No, thank you. No more apologies. Just a small nod, the kind that says more than words could carry." Thomas gave her space, turning to check on the horses without another word. He moved through the stalls with a calm, practiced ease, brushing one gently on the muzzle, topping off another's feed. She watched him for a moment, then silently made her way to the corner he'd pointed out. The hay was soft enough, the blanket thick enough, and for the first time all day she exhaled without panic behind it. She laid down facing the stalls where the gentle breath of the horses rose and fell like lullabies. One of them, a dapple-gray mare, stepped closer to the edge of the stall, watching her curiously. She smiled just faintly and whispered, "Hey there." The mare blinked, then dipped its head slightly, as if in reply. Thomas gave one last glance from across the barn, then dimmed the overhead bulb. "I'll lock the main doors," he said over his shoulder, "but I'll leave the latch easy. You ever need out, just pull." She didn't answer, just curled into the blanket, her bag close beside her. and in the hush of hay and hooves she closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she slept. The sky turned from slate to gold, soft light pouring over the fields like a quiet apology for the storm the night before. Inside the barn, the air had turned cooler but dry, carrying the scent of morning dew, old wood, and horses stretching awake in their stalls. Thomas stepped in just after 6, expecting to find her still asleep. But she was already up, standing near the feed buckets, a little uncertain but trying. She had rolled the blanket neatly, stacked her bag against the wall, and was holding a pitchfork awkwardly, like she'd seen it in a movie once but wasn't sure which end to trust. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You planning to scare the cows or feed them?" She gave him a look, half embarrassed, half defiant. "Which one gets me breakfast?" He smirked. "Feeding earns a plate. Scaring might get you sent out with a black coffee and a warning." She tried to lift a bale of hay, then gave up and leaned against it instead. "I'll take my chances." Her boots were still wet from the night before, and her scarf, clearly more fashion than function, hung limp around her neck. She didn't belong here, not in this barn, not in his morning routine, and yet she moved like someone trying to. Thomas handed her a smaller bundle of feed, guiding her gently toward the nearest stall. "Just drop it in. They'll do the rest." She obeyed, flinching slightly when the horse nudged closer, but she didn't step back. Just stood her ground and smiled, cautiously. "What's her name?" she asked, nodding at the mare from the night before. "Delilah," Thomas replied. "She doesn't usually like strangers." The woman gave a short laugh. "Neither do I." He glanced at her, noting again the city polish beneath the layer of barn dust. She had that kind of accent that sounded more boardroom than backroad, smooth, practiced, like someone used to having the last word. But this morning she kept most of her words to herself. He didn't press. Just handed her the next bucket, and together, in mismatched silence, they fed the animals. The morning wore on slow, like it always did on the farm. Chores were quiet, rhythmic, fences to check, troughs to fill, tools to oil. But even with all that needed doing, Thomas found his attention wandering, drifting toward the woman moving through the barn like a shadow still unsure of the shape she was allowed to take. She didn't talk much. When she did, her voice came measured, as though every word had to pass inspection before it left her lips. She asked where the oats were, not why he was letting her stay. She asked how many horses he had, not whether he'd seen the papers. She was keeping her story under lock and key, and Thomas didn't reach for the handle. He'd seen people on the run before, not always from the law, sometimes just from life. A man who left town after losing his job and never told his wife. A girl who showed up years ago with nothing but a backpack and eyes that never quite stopped searching. Some people left a trail. Others tried to vanish like smoke. But this woman, she wasn't vanishing. She was trying to breathe again. While she swept the barn's entryway, he watched her hands, steady, slow, careful. Not the kind of movement someone made when they planned to bolt. There was a weight in her shoulders, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was something closer to grief. Thomas didn't ask who she was or why she'd landed in his barn in the middle of a rainstorm with eyes full of sorrow and a bag stuffed with secrets. He just kept working. And when noon came and he found her still there, kneeling beside Delilah and stroking her mane like she belonged, he made his choice. "You can stay as long as you need," he said, barely looking up from the axle he was fixing. She paused, fingers stilled in the horse's mane, then turned to him slowly. "Why?" Thomas shrugged. "You look like someone trying to stand still for once." She didn't respond, but something in her softened, like she'd been holding her breath and finally let go. The sun peeked through patchy clouds by mid-afternoon, turning puddles along the dirt path into mirrors. Thomas sat on the porch step, sharpening a worn garden blade, when he heard the barn door creak open behind him. She stepped out slowly, blinking against the light, her hair pulled back in a messy twist, strands clinging to her cheeks. He noticed the heels first, expensive leather caked in dried mud, the kind of shoes nobody in Maplewood wore unless they were driving through on accident. The way she stood in them, uncertain but trying to seem casual, gave her away. Then there were her nails, chipped red polish on hands that still bore the ghost of a manicure, like the city hadn't quite let her go yet. She made her way across the yard carefully, heels sinking into the soft earth, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder. "Is there somewhere I can wash up?" she asked. Thomas nodded toward the outdoor spigot near the shed. "There's soap in the tin bucket beside it. Towel, too." She thanked him, her voice quieter now, less guarded. As she bent over the faucet, splashing water onto her hands, the silence broke. A phone rang, sharp, jarring. The sound of another world bleeding into this one. She froze. It came from her bag, muffled but insistent. Her shoulders tensed, breath catching in her throat, like the ring had yanked her back to wherever she came from. She stared at the bag as if it might explode. Thomas watched from a distance, not moving, not speaking. After a moment, she pulled the zipper open just enough to reach inside and silence the phone. No glance at the screen, no answering, just a long, shaky exhale as the barnyard fell quiet again. Thomas stood, slowly brushing dust from his jeans. "You expecting trouble?" She looked up, eyes unreadable. "Not trouble," she said. "Just people who don't take no for an answer." He nodded once, understanding more than he let on. He didn't press, didn't ask who or why, just offered a simple truth. Well, they won't find much signal out here. And with that he turned back to his work, leaving her to scrub the city from her hands. The morning began like the others, mist curling low over the fields, the sky soft and pale, the barn alive with quiet movement. She had started folding blankets from the hayloft, her duffel bag slouched at her feet, zipper half open from the night before. Thomas was outside feeding the chickens, his boots crunching over gravel, the soft cluck of hens filling the air. She bent to grab the bag, and that's when it happened. A small tug. A catch on the uneven floorboard, then the sound of fabric slipping free. The gown fell in a slow, shimmering wave across the dirt floor. Ivory satin, delicate lace at the bodice, the kind of dress that didn't belong anywhere near hay or horse stalls. It lay there for a breathless moment, glowing faintly in the morning light like a secret too heavy to keep hidden. She didn't move. Neither did Thomas. He had just stepped into the barn's doorway when he saw it. Elegant, unmistakable, and entirely out of place. His gaze traveled from the gown to her frozen posture, to the flash of panic that flickered across her face as she snatched it up and stuffed it back into the bag like it burned to touch. No explanation, no clever excuse, just silence, and the loud, thudding question that neither of them said out loud. Thomas didn't ask. He reached for a shovel, as if the scene before him was nothing more than a passing moment. "Fence out by the orchard's leaning again," he said, his voice even. She nodded stiffly, pressing her lips into a line, the bag now zipped and clutched tighter than before. Later, when they worked side by side fixing the fence, he pretended not to notice the way she kept glancing at the barn, like the truth might spill out again if she looked away too long. And she pretended not to notice the quiet distance in his voice that hadn't been there the day before. They didn't talk about the dress. They didn't need to. But from that morning on, Thomas knew with certainty this woman wasn't lost. She was hiding. The kitchen was already warm when she stepped inside, drawn by the smell of butter and something baking. Thomas stood at the stove, spatula in hand, flipping 2 eggs with the kind of quiet care that only came from habit. A cast-iron skillet hissed softly, and the old radio on the windowsill played low country tunes that sounded like they'd been written before either of them were born. He didn't look up when she entered, just nodded toward the table. "Coffee's fresh, sugar's in the tin, creamer if you want it, but I warn you, it expired last week." She smiled faintly, grateful for the normalcy. "I've had worse." She poured a cup and sat, watching him move around the kitchen with unhurried purpose. The biscuits came out next, golden, slightly uneven, but clearly homemade. He dropped one on each plate, added the eggs, and set them down in front of her like it was the most natural thing in the world. She stared at the food for a second too long. "You all right?" he asked. She blinked. "Yeah, it's just, no one's cooked for me in a long time, not without expecting something." Thomas didn't flinch, just sat across from her and reached for his fork. "It's just breakfast." She took a bite, and her eyes widened. The biscuit was buttery and flaky, the eggs perfectly soft. She closed her eyes for half a second, the taste unlocking something she didn't expect. "This is the best thing I've eaten in years," she said softly. Thomas chuckled under his breath. "You must have had a rough menu." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took another slow bite, as if savoring something more than just food. Across the table, he didn't press. He just ate in silence, the rhythm of the moment steady and comfortable. Outside, the wind rustled the tall grass. Inside, two strangers shared a table like it was the most familiar thing they'd ever done. For a woman used to cold champagne and plated silence, a biscuit in a farmhouse kitchen somehow felt like home. The sun had risen higher than usual by the time Thomas walked the fence line near the eastern pasture. The dew had mostly dried, and the mud had turned to cracked earth in places. He spotted Harold Denton's old pickup rattling toward the property line, the dust cloud behind it signaling trouble or talk, maybe both. Harold parked crooked near the gate and leaned out the window with that ever-curious gleam in his eyes. "Morning, Thomas," he called. "Didn't expect to see footprints other than yours around the barn lately." Thomas didn't break stride. "Mornin', Harold." Harold squinted across the field toward the house. "Saw someone walking toward the porch yesterday. Thought maybe one of your cousins from the city came to visit. Looked like a woman. Pretty one." Thomas paused just enough to let the silence speak. Then he bent down and adjusted the tension on a loose fence wire. Harold tried again. "Everything all right out here?" "Everything's fine." Harold scratched his chin. "Just curious, that's all. Word travels quick out here when new boots show up. Didn't figure you for the house guest type." Thomas stood slowly, wiped his hands on a rag, and turned to face him. His voice was steady. "She's passing through, helping with some chores in exchange for a warm place to stay. Nothing worth gossiping over." Harold raised an eyebrow. "That so?" Thomas nodded. "That's so." Harold sat back in his seat, clearly unsatisfied, but not foolish enough to press further. "Well, all right then. You let me know if you need anything." "I will," Thomas said, already turning back toward the fence. The truck eventually pulled away, and the dust settled behind it. Thomas stayed still for a moment longer, staring out at the distant barn. He hadn't asked for her story, hadn't pressed for a name or a reason, but now he'd lied for her without a second thought. She didn't owe him an explanation, and he didn't need one. In a town where every glance came with a question, Thomas had made a quiet choice. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't his business to expose. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of damp wood and newly turned soil. Thomas was already out by the north fence, a coil of wire slung over his shoulder, hammer in hand, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. The sun hadn't fully burned off the mist yet, leaving the pasture wrapped in a pale haze that made the world feel quiet, suspended. Inside the barn, she sat on a bale of hay, tying her boots with hands still learning the rhythm of country mornings. Her duffel bag rested nearby, half-zipped. The phone inside it beginning to vibrate again, a sharp buzz, then another, then again. Like a ticking clock growing louder in a room too still. She didn't move at first, just stared at the bag like it held something toxic. The phone kept ringing, the sound pressing against her temples, clawing at her calm. She knew the number without looking, same one as yesterday. And the day before that, it had called during breakfast, during the evening rain, always at the same hour, always unrelenting. This time she didn't even reach for it. She stood, slipped her jacket on, and walked out into the cold. Thomas glanced up as she approached, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "You're late," he said, though there was no bite in his tone. She smirked faintly, tugging on a pair of borrowed gloves. "I had a meeting. I declined." He didn't ask what kind of meeting. She didn't offer more. They worked together in companionable silence, driving nails into old cedar posts and weaving wire through tired rails. She held the fence steady while he hammered. He passed her the cutters without being asked. The rhythm of the work pulled her out of her thoughts, grounded her in something simple, tangible. Back in the barn, the phone finally stopped. She never mentioned the call, neither did Thomas, because some things didn't need to be answered to be understood. The sun hung low over the fields, casting a honeyed glow across the grass as evening settled in. Thomas stood by the water trough, sleeves rolled to his elbows, boots scuffed from a day that had started before the rooster crowed. He smelled of sweat, dust, and the faint trace of engine grease that never quite washed away. His flannel shirt was faded, elbows worn through, but it fit him like it had grown into his skin. She sat nearby on the porch step, sipping from a chipped enamel mug filled with peppermint tea. Her hair was pulled back with a silk scarf, pale blue with delicate patterns, the kind that didn't belong in barns or fields. It caught the light when the breeze stirred, a whisper of softness against the rough edges of the farm. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. He came and went with tasks that didn't require explanation. She followed where she could, offering a hand, a gesture, sometimes just presence. And when they paused, whether at the fence line or under the old oak near the pasture, the silence stretched between them like a bridge, not a wall. She watched him now as he worked, hammering something into place with a calm patience. There was nothing polished about him. He didn't glance at mirrors. He didn't measure his worth by words or wins. And yet, she felt steadier near him than she ever had, surrounded by wealth and noise. Thomas eventually looked up, catching her eye. He gave a slight nod, acknowledging her without expectation. She nodded back, lips curling just slightly. Two people who didn't fit the same world. One born into hard labor and worn routines. The other raised in a maze of meetings, marble floors, and muted pain behind expensive smiles. But somehow, here on this porch, with dusk unfolding and the crickets beginning their song, the difference didn't feel like a gap. It felt like balance. And though nothing was said, something passed between them, a shared breath, a silent truce, and maybe the beginning of something neither of them had planned on finding. The bell above the gas station door gave a tired jingle as she stepped inside, the dry heat from the overhead vents brushing against her chilled skin. The place smelled like old coffee, motor oil, and pine-scented air fresheners. She kept her head down, hoping no one would look twice at a woman wearing a borrowed flannel and muddy jeans, her silk scarf tucked in her pocket. Thomas had sent her in for a gallon of milk and a few bolts from the supply shelf. It was supposed to be a simple errand, in and out. But as she passed the magazine rack near the register, her steps slowed. There, in glossy color, was her face. Front page of one of those loud, shameless tabloids. A photo from a gala 3 months back, smiling, elegant, hand looped around a man in a tux. The headline screamed across the page in capital letters, "Runaway heiress vanishes before wedding. Where is Melina Grayson?" She stared at it, frozen. Beneath the photo, a collage of speculation, a tearful fiancé at a press conference, her father outside a courthouse, security camera stills of an airport terminal. The words blurred, but the story was clear. They were still looking for her. A lump tightened in her throat, but she didn't reach for the magazine, didn't crumple it, didn't even touch it. She looked away slowly, blinked twice, and forced herself to keep walking. At the cooler, she grabbed the milk. At the hardware shelf, the bolts. And at the counter, she gave a tight smile to the cashier who didn't recognize her. No one said her name. No one stared too long. Not here. Back in the truck, Thomas didn't ask why her hands were shaking slightly as she buckled in. He just started the engine and pulled onto the gravel road. She stared out the window, the trees blurring past. She didn't tell him. Not about the magazine. Not about the headline. Not about the name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in days. Because on this farm, in borrowed clothes with dirt under her fingernails, she wasn't Melina Grayson. She was just the woman helping fix fences, and that was enough. The midday sun hung warm and forgiving above the fields, softening the soil beneath their boots as Thomas knelt beside the garden bed, sleeves pushed up and hands already stained with earth. The old seed packets were spread out on a nearby crate, corn, beans, carrots. He held up the last one and glanced over his shoulder. "You ever plant anything before?" She raised an eyebrow. "I once paid a florist to install succulents in my condo." He chuckled. "Yeah, that doesn't count." She joined him anyway, crouching beside the furrowed rows, watching him dig a shallow trench with the edge of his hand. He moved with the quiet patience of someone who had learned not to rush things that needed time. "Finger deep," he said, showing her how to nestle the seeds. A little space between them, not too close, not too far. She mimicked him, fumbling at first. Her hands weren't used to this, used to keyboards, leather steering wheels, glass elevators, but still she tried. The soil was cool and soft, clinging to her fingers like it knew she didn't belong, but welcomed her anyway. When a clump of dirt slipped and landed squarely under her nail, she winced, then laughed. A sudden, unguarded sound that startled even her. She paused, the smile still caught between her teeth. Thomas looked up. "Something funny?" She shook her head, brushing her hand on her jeans. "I think this is the first time I've ever gotten my hands dirty without someone else cleaning up after me." He gave a small grin. "That's kind of the point." She looked down at her fingers, smudged, unpolished, imperfect, and then back at the neat little row of seeds they'd buried together. "It feels good," she admitted quietly. "Like something I earned." Thomas didn't say anything. He just handed her the next packet and moved to the next row. And there, under a wide sky and a rhythm of shared silence, she planted something more than carrots. Something small, something honest, something that didn't need to be hidden. And for the first time in weeks, the laugh stayed with her. The barn was quiet that night, the kind of stillness that made every creak in the rafters feel louder than it should. The horses had long since settled, their steady breaths rising in the warm air. She sat alone at the small wooden desk Thomas kept near the feed chart, a stub of pencil in hand and an old notepad in front of her, its pages yellowed and curled at the edges. For a while she just stared at the blank paper. The words had been caught in her chest for days, maybe longer. All the things she hadn't said when she left. All the truths she never dared voice. But now, with only the hum of the stove and the occasional shuffle of hooves around her, she began to write. She didn't start with "Dear." It felt wrong. She wrote his name, just his name. Then the truth. Why she ran, why she felt like a guest in her own life. How the wedding had become a theater production she didn't believe in. How every time someone told her she was lucky, she felt like she was drowning in someone else's good fortune. How she smiled through things that felt more like cages than choices. And how the moment she stepped into this quiet barn, in clothes that didn't match and hair pulled back with twine instead of silk, she finally felt like a person again. She filled 3 pages, carefully, slowly, honestly. Then she folded them once, twice, held them between her fingers like maybe she would mail it. Maybe he deserved the truth, even if it came late. But the fire in the stove was low, glowing red in the corner of the room. She stood, walked over, and opened the small iron door. For a long moment she hesitated. Then she fed the letter in, page by page. The flames curled each one, darkening the edges, turning confessions into ash. No one would ever read it. And maybe that was the point. Some truths were meant to be felt, not shared. And this one, This one was hers to let go. The rain started in the early afternoon, slow and steady, a whisper across the roof of the house. By dusk it had turned into a downpour, sheets of water pounding against the windows, wind howling through the trees like it was trying to pull the whole world sideways. Thomas stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the gravel driveway disappear beneath a thin river of mud. She joined him quietly, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, hair damp from a dash to the barn. "The road's gone," she said, not quite surprised. He nodded. "Flooded at the bend near Denton's field. You're not going anywhere tonight." She didn't seem disappointed, just stepped closer, the rain misting her face as thunder rolled low in the distance. The power went out just after 6. A soft snap, then darkness. Thomas didn't flinch. "Happens every year," he muttered, already reaching for the matches in the drawer. They lit 3 candles, one on the kitchen table, one near the stove, and one that flickered on the windowsill. The old farmhouse glowed gold and warm, like a memory brought back to life. The radio was silent, the fridge quiet, and the world beyond the glass was nothing but storm and wind. In the dim light, she rummaged through the pantry and held up a can of baked beans. "Gourmet." He smirked. "Only the best, hand-selected from the top shelf of aisle 3. They sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table, spoons tapping gently against metal. The beans were lukewarm, the bread dry, but neither of them complained. The flickering candle between them made her eyes look softer, and for once she didn't seem to be guarding every glance. When the thunder cracked loud enough to rattle the windows, she laughed, a full, unfiltered sound that filled the room. Thomas looked up from his can. "You laughing at the storm?" "No," she said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "I think I'm just tired of pretending I'm not scared of it." He nodded once, thoughtful. "Nothing wrong with being scared." "No," she agreed, smile lingering, "but it feels a lot better when you're not alone in it." The tractor had been sitting idle for weeks, rust clinging to its joints like old regrets. Thomas had meant to fix it. He always meant to fix it, but other things had gotten in the way. Fences to mend, animals to tend, unexpected company to make space for. She found it one morning while helping him clear tools from the shed. "What's wrong with it?" she asked, brushing off a layer of dust from the hood. "Starter's temperamental. Fuel line's gummed up. Might be the solenoid. I haven't had the time." She didn't press, but later that afternoon, when Thomas was out in the pasture checking the herd, she returned to the tractor alone. She propped her phone up on a paint can, sat cross-legged in the grass, and pulled up videos with titles like "Fixing an Old Massey Ferguson Starter, No Mechanic Needed," and "How to Clean a Fuel Line Without Losing Your Mind." The first attempt left her with grease on her cheek and a scraped knuckle. The second left her swearing under her breath when the wrench slipped. But she didn't quit. Thomas found her 2 hours later, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back with her scarf, one leg sticking out from under the engine compartment. "You trying to kill yourself?" he asked, more amused than annoyed. She slid out, wiping her hands. "Nope, just trying to get it to purr again." He raised an eyebrow. "That so?" "Yep. Thought I'd trade in my perfume for diesel." She reached back in, tightened one last bolt, then climbed into the driver's seat. Turned the key. For a second, nothing. Then, with a reluctant sputter, the engine coughed to life. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't pretty, but it ran. She grinned, triumphant, and glanced down at him from the seat. "Told you YouTube was good for something." Thomas stared at her, not at the engine, not at the fix, but at her. The dirt under her nails, the fire in her eyes, the grit that didn't match her silk scarf, but fit her perfectly. In that moment, she wasn't a runaway. She was someone rewriting who she was, bolt by bolt. The storm returned fast, as if the sky had been waiting for the right moment to break again. Rain slammed against the roof in bursts, and the barn rattled with each gust of wind. Thomas was in the loft checking the tarp for leaks, while she stood below near the lantern, arms folded tight, watching the shadows flicker across the wooden beams. Another thunderclap cracked so loud it made the walls tremble. She flinched, jaw clenched, eyes suddenly wet, but not from the rain. Thomas climbed down slowly, noticing the change in her posture, the tension, curling through her like a wire pulled too tight. "You okay?" he asked, voice low, steady. She didn't answer right away, just stared at the hay-strewn floor like it had spoken first. Then, as another boom echoed overhead, it came out. "I ran from my wedding." The words landed like a stone in the quiet that followed. Thomas didn't speak, didn't shift, just waited. She kept her eyes on the floor, voice shaking now that it had started. "I was supposed to marry someone I didn't love, someone my parents chose, a deal between families dressed up as a love story." She exhaled hard, almost angry. Everything was planned. The flowers, the menu, the music, down to the second I was supposed to smile and say yes. Thomas took a step closer, but didn't interrupt. I sat in that dressing room with a dress I hated, listening to people toast to a future I never wanted, and I realized, if I didn't leave then, I never would. She looked up finally, eyes shining, mouth trembling between defiance and regret. "So I left. I took the car. I didn't pack right. I didn't have a plan, I just drove, and I kept driving until there was nowhere left but here." Thomas studied her for a long breath. Then he reached over, gently pulled a loose piece of straw from her scarf and said, "Well, you landed in the right place to be nobody for a while." She blinked, surprised. And just like that, the storm outside felt a little less loud. The rain softened by morning, tapering into a steady drizzle that whispered against the barn roof like it was trying to apologize for last night's fury. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet hay and old wood. She sat on the edge of the stall gate, hair damp, sleeves rolled past her elbows, staring into the quiet with puffy eyes and a heart still thudding from everything she'd let slip the night before. She half expected Thomas to avoid her, or worse, to push for more, to ask for details, to remind her she was a stranger in borrowed clothes who had dropped a bombshell between thunderclaps. But when he appeared in the doorway, boots muddy and shoulders soaked from the walkover, he didn't say a word, just walked in, wrung out his cap, and handed her a clean towel from the hook by the saddle rack. She blinked at it, unsure. He met her gaze, calm as ever. "You're still dripping." She took it, clutching the fabric like it meant something. He moved toward the feed bins, started scooping oats into buckets like it was any other day. No wide eyes, no judgment, just the quiet rhythm of someone who had seen enough of life to know when to let a person breathe. She stood slowly, unsure how to step back into normalcy after laying her truth bare like that. But then Thomas, still measuring out the grain, said over his shoulder, "Everyone runs from something." She looked up. He kept working, never turning. "You're just doing it in heels." It startled a laugh from her, a soft, surprised thing that slipped out before she could stop it. She wiped her face with the towel. "They're ruined, you know." He glanced back, a hint of a grin tugging at his mouth. "Then maybe you'll stay long enough to wear out a pair of boots instead." She didn't answer, but for the first time since she arrived, the idea didn't scare her. The sound reached them before the sight did. Gravel crunching beneath heavy tires, slow and deliberate, like something coming that didn't intend to turn around. Thomas looked up from the chicken coop, wiping his hands on a rag. She was nearby, kneeling in the garden, pulling weeds with dirt-stained gloves and the sun on her back. For a second the world was still. Then the black SUV came into view, crawling up the long driveway like a shadow with headlights. She froze. Thomas noticed the change in her posture immediately, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her fingers clutched the weeds like she needed something to hold on to. Her breath hitched, and the blood drained from her face as the vehicle rolled to a stop in front of the house. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a sharp charcoal suit, his hair wind-swept but deliberate. expression tight with worry and something harder beneath it, control. He didn't look around, his eyes locked on her like they'd been searching across maps and miles. "Melina," he said, voice firm and lined with frustration. She stood slowly, trembling slightly, dust on her knees, gloves still on. "Ethan!" Thomas stayed where he was, silent but steady, eyes on the stranger, reading the tension in the air like weather before a storm. "You've got everyone losing their minds," Ethan snapped, walking toward her. "Do you even realize what you've done?" She stepped back. "I know exactly what I did." He looked around the farm, disgust barely veiled. "This? This is where you disappeared to?" "I didn't disappear, I left." "You embarrassed the family. You humiliated David. Thomas took a step forward then, slow and measured, wiping his hands on the rag again. "That's enough." Ethan turned, eyes narrowing. "And you are someone who doesn't take kindly to raised voices on his land." The two men locked eyes. Neither blinked. Melina's voice broke the standoff. "You should go, Ethan." But her brother didn't move. Not yet. Because the past had found her, and it wasn't letting go without a fight. The barn door creaked in the wind as Thomas leaned against its frame, arms crossed, jaw set. The late afternoon light spilled across the yard in long golden streaks, but the tension in the air turned everything cold. Ethan stood near the porch, tie loosened, hands on his hips, pacing like a man too used to getting answers without asking twice. "She won't talk to me," he said sharply, turning to face Thomas. "Won't return calls. Won't explain a thing. And now you're hiding her?" Thomas didn't flinch. "I'm not hiding anyone." "Then tell me where she is." "No," Thomas said, plain and unmoving. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I don't need to," Thomas replied, voice quiet but solid as bedrock. "What I do know is she's safe here. She's not locked in, not under guard. If she wants to go back with you, she will." Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't about safety. It's about responsibility, family. Do you even know what she walked away from?" "I don't need to know," Thomas said again, slower this time. "That's her story, not mine, and definitely not yours to force out." The wind caught the edge of Ethan's coat, flaring it slightly as he looked past Thomas toward the fields. There was a flicker of something, doubt maybe, or recognition that this man, quiet and stubborn, wasn't about to move just because someone from a richer world barked twice. "She's hurting people," Ethan muttered. "There are headlines. Investors. People asking questions." Thomas stepped off the frame and onto the porch, calm but firm. "Sounds like you're worried about your name, not her." That struck a nerve. Ethan's mouth twitched, but he didn't argue. Thomas looked him straight in the eye. "She's not your property. She's a grown woman. She stays here because she wants to. And she'll leave when she's ready, not because you showed up with a suit and a lecture." For a long moment no one moved. Then Ethan exhaled through his nose, sharp and bitter. "This isn't over." Thomas nodded once. "Didn't think it was." And with that Ethan turned, got back into the SUV, and drove off. He never saw her watching from behind the curtain, but she saw everything. She sat on the floor just inside the back mudroom, knees pulled to her chest, heart pounding in her ears as the voices from outside filtered through the thin wooden walls. They weren't shouting, but it was louder than silence, and every word her brother said cut like a memory she hadn't asked to relive. She had known Ethan would come eventually, known that someone from that world, the world of white gowns and cold diamonds and scripted futures, would come looking. She just hadn't expected Thomas to stand between it and her like a barn door in a storm. She heard it all, every calm refusal, every line he drew without raising his voice. And when the SUV finally peeled away, kicking gravel into the wind, she didn't cry. She just sat there, still, shaking a little. But still. That night, she didn't sleep. The storm was gone, but her mind wasn't quiet. She lay awake in the loft above the stalls, staring at the rafters. tracing the patterns of old beams and forgotten cobwebs. Her breath rose and fell with the soft rhythm of the horses below, but inside her thoughts thundered louder than any hoofbeat. She thought of the dress in her bag, of Ethan's face, of Thomas's eyes when he said, "She's safe here." She thought of how it felt to fix a tractor with her bare hands, to laugh over canned beans, to get dirt under her nails planting carrots she might someday eat. She thought of the silence that didn't demand anything from her, the quiet that didn't press her to smile or explain or pretend. And when the first pale threads of dawn reached over the hills, brushing the barn in soft gold, she sat up slowly. She didn't need a mirror to know something in her face had changed. She climbed down from the loft barefoot, walked past the still sleeping horses, and out into the morning air with bare arms and steady breath. She looked at the road, the one Ethan had come from, the one she'd escaped on, and then she turned away from it. She wasn't going back. The general store smelled like sawdust and old leather, sunlight streaming through the dusty front windows in strips that made everything feel like a snapshot from another life. She stepped through the door alone, her scarf tied loose around her neck, the duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Inside it, tucked in the bottom, were the heels she'd worn the day she left everything behind, scuffed, mud-stained, still holding the memory of cold pavement and shaking hands. She wandered past rows of canned goods, tractor oil, and mason jars until she found the boots, sturdy, worn-looking, even when new, the kind of shoes meant for mud, not marble. Her fingers hesitated over the laces, brushing the leather slowly, as if touching a choice before she spoke it aloud. The clerk approached. "Looking for something special?" She gave him a small smile. "No, just something that lasts." She bought them with crumpled bills Thomas had slipped her quietly for helping mend the fence last week. No credit cards, no signatures, no last names. Out front, she sat on the store's wooden steps and unzipped her bag. She pulled out the heels, the designer ones with the gold lettering on the insole and a story in every scuff. She held them in her hands for a long moment, then set them gently on the edge of the bench, not thrown away, just left behind. Then she slipped her feet into the boots. They didn't fit perfectly, not yet, but they were honest, heavy in the right way, meant to carry weight. Back at the farm, Thomas didn't say anything when he saw them, just nodded once from where he stood by the chicken coop. But she caught the flicker in his eyes, the quiet recognition. This wasn't a costume, not a disguise for hiding. She wasn't pretending anymore. She wasn't the runaway heiress trying to pass the time. She was someone who chose to stay, someone ready to work, to walk, to root herself in something real. And these boots, they weren't just shoes. They were a beginning. The late afternoon sun stretched long across the fields, casting everything in amber. The fence line buzzed with the low hum of insects and the soft creak of weathered wood. Thomas was tying off a new section of wire, his hands moving with quiet precision. She stood beside him, holding the spool steady, the two of them working in the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Their shoulders bumped more than once, each time unspoken, each time left alone. He passed her a pair of gloves without looking, but their fingers brushed, brief, warm, and longer than necessary. Neither of them said anything. But something shifted. She leaned against the fence post while he tested the tension. "It's almost straight," she said, tilting her head with a small smile. "You're slipping." He glanced sideways at her. "Blame the company." She laughed, soft and natural. It echoed across the empty pasture like it belonged there. They moved to the next section, but slower this time. Less about finishing, more about staying in the moment. The last loop of wire was stubborn, and she reached to hold it down just as he did. Their hands landed together, palm against palm. She looked up, surprised by how close he suddenly felt, and he didn't step back. Neither did she. The wind picked up, tugging at her scarf. A bird chirped somewhere far off. Time bent for just a second, and then they kissed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't scripted, just simple, unsure, and real. A touch of mouths, soft and slow, like testing the waters of something neither of them had dared name. When they pulled apart, her eyes searched his, steady and a little breathless. "That was unexpected," she murmured. Thomas gave a small nod. "Yeah, but not wrong." "No," he said, not wrong." She smiled, the kind that bloomed slow and wide, and turned back to the fence. They finished the last wire together, side by side, hands still warm. And though nothing more was said, the space between them had changed. Not filled, just finally open. The first whispers started at the diner. Mrs. Talbot, who sat by the window every morning with her crossword and too much cream in her coffee, spotted the stranger in boots and a borrowed flannel walking beside Thomas on Market Street. They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. The way their shoulders leaned just slightly toward each other said enough. By afternoon, the whispers had traveled from the post office to the feed store and back again. "Thomas has a woman out at the farm. She's not from around here. Heard she's from the city. She looks like someone who used to be somebody." And just like that, Maplewood did what Maplewood always did. It noticed. Some folks tilted their heads with curiosity. Others raised their eyebrows with concern. People remembered the last time someone new passed through and didn't stay. Small towns had long memories and short patience. But this felt different. She wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy, she didn't seem like trouble, not exactly. And Thomas, well, Thomas had never looked lighter. The man who used to nod and grunt his way through conversation had started smiling more, laughing even. He showed up to the hardware store cleaner than usual, and someone swore they saw him buying flowers at the stand by the school. "He's got that look," said old Roy from the mechanic shop, pointing to his own face, "the kind of look a man gets when he doesn't want something. He needs it." Still, not everyone was sold. "She's running from something," muttered Gail from the quilting club. "Women don't end up on a farm in the middle of nowhere without a reason." But most didn't mind. Maplewood knew love when it saw it, even if it arrived muddy and unannounced. And as the days passed and her name still stayed unspoken, they started calling her something else. Thomas's girl. Not with mockery, not with malice, just with a little hope. Because in a town where nothing stayed secret, this felt less like scandal and more like a story worth watching. The knock on the farmhouse door came just as the sky turned that soft gray that meant rain was close but hadn't made up its mind. Thomas was out in the shed, and she was slicing apples in the kitchen, the radio humming something gentle from the corner. When she opened the door, the knife still in her hand, her heart dropped. David stood there, pressed shirt, neatly trimmed hair, the same dark eyes she used to think held safety. Now, they only reflected a life she'd stepped away from. "Melina," he said, voice quiet, uncertain. "Can I come in?" She didn't answer right away, just stepped aside. He entered slowly, glancing around the modest kitchen. It smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke. He looked out of place here, like someone wearing a suit to a bonfire. "I've been looking for you," he said. "Not just me, your father, your mother. They're worried." She set the knife down. "Worried about me or about the headlines?" He flinched. "Both." He sat at the table without being asked. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve. "I'm not here to yell or to drag you back. I need to understand." She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You want the truth?" He nodded. "Yes, please." So she gave it to him. She told him about the suffocation, about how every choice had been made for her, from the dress to the guest list to the vows she was supposed to recite with a smile. She told him how tired she was of performing, of being seen and not known, of being someone's daughter, someone's fiancée, someone's accessory to a life that never felt like hers. "I didn't run because I hated you," she said, her voice breaking. "I ran because I didn't know who I was anymore. And I was scared I never would." David sat in silence for a long moment, then nodded slowly, not angry, just sad. I wish you'd said something before. She looked out the window where Thomas was walking toward the barn, unaware of the visitor inside. I didn't know how, she whispered. David stood. You look different. She smiled, small but true. I feel different. And for the first time, he seemed to believe her. They stepped out onto the porch together, the late afternoon sun cutting through the trees in soft beams, painting the floorboards in gold. David stood with his hands in his pockets, staring out over the fields like he was trying to understand what had drawn her here, what had kept her. She didn't rush him. She had said what needed saying. For once, silence wasn't something she feared. I meant what I said, he began, voice careful. I know we didn't build things right. I know it wasn't fair. She looked over, waiting. I'm not here to shame you back into anything. I'm just offering something simpler. No big wedding, no contracts, just you and me. A chance to start fresh. There was something in his eyes, sincerity maybe, or maybe just the ache of someone who thought they could patch a cracked vase if they held it tightly enough. She reached for the railing, her fingers curling around the worn wood. I believe you mean that, she said softly. And a few weeks ago maybe I would have said yes just to stop the world from spinning. He turned to her, hope flickering. But no. The word came gently, but firmly. No, she repeated, stronger now. Because I'm not the person you proposed to. I'm not even the person who left that night. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. She wasn't hiding anymore. David swallowed hard, nodding slowly. So this place, it changed you? She looked out at the field, where a lone figure in flannel was checking the fence line. She thought about dirt under her nails, canned beans by candlelight, the kiss by the fence post, and the boots still sitting by the back door. No, she said, it reminded me who I was before I got lost. David stepped back, his sadness quieter now. Then I hope you never lose her again. She smiled, not out of guilt, not out of pity, just out of peace. Me too. The sky was streaked with the soft pinks and purples of a quiet evening, the kind that wrapped the farm in stillness. Thomas stood by the shed, coiling rope with the kind of focus that gave his hands something to do while his thoughts wandered elsewhere. Behind him, the barn door stood open, letting in the warm breath of hay and horses. She found him there, her boots crunching softly over gravel, a folded note in her back pocket she'd written, but never needed to give. Her scarf was looped loosely around her neck, not because it matched anything, but because it smelled like the barn, the fields, and faintly, him. He looked up as she approached, squinting against the setting sun. Fence all right? She asked gently. Needs work, he replied, setting the rope down, but it'll hold for now. She nodded, then stood there quietly for a moment, hands in her jacket pockets, rocking on her heels. Thomas waited, sensing something unspoken just behind her breath. Finally, she looked at him, eyes steady. I've been thinking, she said, about where I go from here, what I'm supposed to do next. He didn't speak, just watched. She exhaled slowly. And I keep coming back to this place, to you, to mornings that smell like coffee and dirt, to quiet dinners and fixing broken things. And I realized. She paused, almost laughing at herself. I don't want to leave, not because I'm running anymore, but because I'm finally still. Thomas took a small step closer, the air between them warm with everything unspoken. I'm not asking for anything fancy, she said, voice soft but clear. Not a ring, not a big moment. I just want to know if I can stay, really stay. Not as a guest, not as a problem you're helping solve, but as your partner. His eyes didn't change, but something in them settled deeper, like a storm pulling back. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You already are. And with that, no promises were needed, because something better had already been made. The old frame sat at the edge of the property, half covered in weeds, its metal ribs poking from the earth like the bones of a dream someone had given up on. Thomas had mentioned it once, how he always meant to rebuild the greenhouse, but never found the time, or maybe the reason. Now they had both. She stood beside him in the early morning light, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, work gloves tugged tight. The sun had barely cleared the hills, casting a gold wash over the field as they surveyed what would become theirs. Not just his land, not just her refuge, but something they were shaping together. He handed her a wrench without a word, and she began unfastening rusted bolts, laughing when one snapped off in her hand. "Guess these don't age like wine," she said, holding up the ruined piece. Thomas chuckled. "They've been waiting a while." They worked side by side for hours, measuring beams, cutting panels, laying out the skeleton of something small but alive with possibility. Dirt dusted their faces, sweat soaked through cotton, and more than once they stopped to just look at it, the shape of what was coming into view. He taught her how to drill anchors into the ground. She showed him how to level a frame using just a string and a nail. Every shared task felt like stitching pieces of themselves into something new, not perfect, but real. During a break, she sat on the grass with her knees pulled up, looking at the structure rising behind them. "Feels like planting more than seeds," she said. Thomas nodded, wiping his hands with a rag. "Feels like putting down roots." She looked over at him, eyes soft, lips curved. "I didn't think I'd ever do that again." "Me neither," he admitted. The wind shifted gently, rustling the plastic sheeting still waiting to be laid. Overhead, the clouds moved slow, like the sky itself had stopped to watch. They weren't just building a greenhouse. They were building something they'd never dared name before. A future. The sun was warm on the back of her neck as she walked through the town square, a basket of fresh produce tucked in her arm. The Saturday market buzzed around her, neighbors chatting over tomatoes, teenagers juggling paper bags, the scent of cinnamon rolls drifting from the bakery window. She moved through it quietly, smiling, nodding, invisible enough to feel safe. Until a small voice stopped her near the flower stand. "Are you the princess who moved to the farm?" She turned and found a girl no older than 7, freckle-faced and wide-eyed, holding a jar of homemade jam with both hands like it was treasure. The question hung there, curious, but without any trace of malice. "Excuse me?" she asked, crouching slightly to meet the girl's eye. The little one rocked back on her heels. "My friend said a princess came here and lives with the man who fixes everything. You have fancy hair and boots like the teachers on picture day. So I thought, maybe it's you." She blinked, taken off guard, then laughed. A real laugh, full and surprised. "No," she said gently, her voice softer than she meant. "I'm not a princess." The girl tilted her head. "But you used to be?" She thought for a second, then nodded slowly. "Kind of. I used to be someone else, someone with a lot of dresses and parties and people telling me who I was. And now? Now?" She looked past the market, toward the hills that cradled the farm. "Now? I'm just a girl who got lost and found herself again in the dirt." The little girl nodded like that made perfect sense. "That sounds better than being a princess." She smiled. "Yeah, it is." The girl grinned, then skipped off to join her mother. As she watched her go, she caught the gaze of an old woman at the jam table, who winked knowingly. She straightened up, adjusted her basket, and walked on. No tiara, no title. Just someone becoming exactly who she was always meant to be. Thomas left before sunrise, heading out to a neighboring farm to help mend a busted irrigation line. He said he'd be gone all day. Didn't think much of it when she kissed his cheek and packed him a lunch, though she'd seemed unusually eager to wave him off. The moment his truck disappeared over the hill, she set the plan in motion. It had started weeks ago with a joke, her teasing him about the barn, the peeling paint, the way the red had faded into something closer to rust and memory. He'd shrugged and said it didn't bother him. but she'd seen the way his eyes lingered on it when he thought no one was watching. So she went to work. She'd talk to the town quietly. Emily from the school brought her dad. Mrs. Talbot came with cookies and extra brushes. Even Roy from the mechanic shop rolled up with an old ladder and a half-smile that said, "Don't make this sentimental." All day, under the soft hum of country music and the laughter of people who hadn't had a reason to gather in a while, they painted. Coats of bright, fresh red swept over the old wood like a second chance. She worked the hardest, smearing more on her jeans than the wall half the time, climbing up the ladder and smudging her cheek with paint she didn't notice. Every stroke felt like love in motion, unspoken but understood. By late afternoon, the last brush was rinsed, the last hand waved goodbye. She sat on the porch steps, exhausted but glowing. Then she heard the truck. Thomas pulled up slow, brow furrowed as he stepped out, expecting everything to be the same, but when he turned toward the barn, he froze. The sun had begun to dip, casting firelight across the hill, and there it was, his barn, gleaming red like it had been waiting all these years to come back to life. She stood, nervous now. "Surprise," she said softly. He didn't speak, just looked at it, then at her, and then he smiled, bigger than she'd ever seen. "You painted my past," he said, voice thick, "and gave it a future." Morning came quiet. The sky washed in soft blues and pale gold. Dew clung to the garden leaves like little promises, and she stood at the edge of the rows with dirt on her knees, staring at the lettuce she had planted weeks ago. It had sprouted almost shyly at first, tiny, unsure, but now it stood full and vibrant, glowing under the morning light with crisp, proud leaves. Thomas was nearby fixing a gate hinge, glancing over now and then, but giving her space. He knew this was her moment. She reached down, fingers brushing the base of the first head, feeling the cool weight of it in her hands. The scent of earth rose around her, clean and rich, the smell of something real. Something earned. She pulled gently, and the roots came free with a quiet snap. That's when it hit her. She crouched there, lettuce cradled in her arms like something delicate. And the tears came, sudden, soft, unstoppable, not loud, not dramatic, just tears that had been waiting. She didn't sob, she didn't wipe them away, she just let them fall. Because it wasn't just lettuce, it was proof. Proof that she could grow something, that she could stay somewhere long enough to see a beginning turn into something beautiful, that she was no longer just surviving or running or pretending. She was rooted in dirt, in effort, in this life. Thomas didn't come over. He just kept working, letting her be. She was grateful for that. Later, when she walked back to the house with a basket full of green, eyes still red but face glowing, he met her on the porch. "Looks good," he said. She nodded. "Tastes better?" He didn't ask why her cheeks were damp. She didn't explain. Some harvests speak for themselves. And this one, this first crop under her hands, was more than food. It was healing. The evening air was thick with the scent of soil and honeysuckle, the sun bleeding into the horizon like it had nowhere else to be. She was pulling weeds near the carrot rows, her sleeves rolled up, dirt caked beneath her nails, when Thomas wandered over with his hands in his pockets and that unreadable half-smile on his face. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to a patch of soil just beyond her reach. She gave him a look. "I've been at this for 2 hours. Humor me." With a sigh and a teasing roll of her eyes, she moved over to where he stood. The soil was softer there, freshly turned in a way that made her suspicious. "Did you bury something weird again, like that wrench you lost last week?" He shrugged. "Maybe." Still playing along, she dug with her hands, brushing past clumps of dirt until her fingers struck something hard. Square, smooth, out of place. She froze, looked up at him, then back down. It was a small wooden box, barely larger than her palm. Her breath caught. She lifted it carefully, brushing away the earth, and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in a bit of cotton, was a ring, simple, elegant, a single stone that caught the last light of the day and shimmered like it had been waiting just as long as she had. She looked up, eyes wide, heart pounding. Thomas knelt, not formally, not theatrically, just dropped to one knee in the dirt beside her. No speech, no spotlight, just this. "I didn't want to make a big thing of it," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know that I'm all in, that you're home, if you want to be." She blinked fast, a tear slipping down her cheek, mixing with the dirt smudged across her skin, and then she nodded. Not because it was perfect, not because it was expected, but because it was him, and it was enough. They didn't need champagne. They had soil under their nails. And that was more honest than any ceremony. The field looked almost the same. Rows of carrots and lettuce stretched neatly toward the horizon, the old barn standing proud in its coat of red, its walls holding the quiet stories of seasons come and gone. The air was thick with the scent of earth and warm hay, and birds sang from the trees like they'd always known this land was sacred. She walked slowly, boots muddy from the morning rain. Her daughter perched on her hip, one small arm looped around her neck. The little girl had Thomas's calm eyes and her stubborn jaw, and she was asking endless questions the way 3-year-olds do about clouds and cows and why worms lived in dirt. As they reached the carrot row, she paused, crouched down, and ran her free hand through the soil. "Right here," she said softly. The little girl tilted her head. "What's here, Mama?" "This," she smiled, "this is where everything changed." The child blinked, curious. So she told the story, not with the full weight of who she used to be, but in the way you tell a fairy tale that's too real to be made up. "I was lost," she said gently. "Not the kind of lost where you need a map, the kind where you forget who you are. I had fancy shoes and cold hands and no idea what came next. Then I found a barn, and a man who didn't ask questions. He just handed me a blanket and let me breathe." Her daughter listened, still and wide-eyed. "I slept right there, near the horses. I didn't know it then, but that was the first night of my real life." She stood, brushing her knees, shifting her daughter's weight. In the distance, Thomas was waving from the porch, a mug in one hand and flour on his shirt. "And now?" the girl asked. "Now," she said, turning toward home, "I'm not running any more." They walked together hand in hand, and with every step through the soft, forgiving soil, she knew. This wasn't the life she planned, but it was the life that saved her.